At the end of July 2017, when I made up my mind to travel from Iowa City, Iowa to Ann Arbor, Michigan riding a bike, I bought my GoPro camera. The plan was to film as much as possible of each day's journey, write down where I had been and what I saw each day, and compile the footage into an epic, possibly multi-part video travelogue in the vein of my favorite YouTuber Noah Caldwell-Gervais. The plan also said the project would be finished no later than September that year. Given the fact it is October 2022 and my YouTube channel is still 99% someone else's copyrighted content, that plan clearly fell apart. I did film the footage, and I was almost a third of my way into the writing process, already covering the first 2 days of my 8 days journey. I rewatched those footage again and again and tried to piece them together into some kind of culture and geographical cohesion and significance true to Midwestern, mostly rural America. But the creative inertia eventually crumbled as I realized the simple truth that I was an outsider and a passerby. Even just writing for the first 2 days, I retroactively looked up the history and interest of places I skirted by briefly without batting an eye at the moment to pad the pages. My eyes were ironed in the direction where the wheels rolled toward, and everything that occupied my mind was when could I get under some roofs, preferably air-conditioned, to avoid the late summer sun, and how I might have not thought this plan through. Plus, the puny SD card that came in the package can only hold up to 2.5 hours of footage when stretched to the limit, so I had to use it sparingly. The camera model was also a cheap little thing. The result is that what I did film was often wobbly and slightly blurry thanks to the evaporated sweat and the moisture covering the lenses, and they are often of places I imagine would make good material instead of moments that actually struck me pretty hard. Turns out real life isn't like video games. Here, tell Xbox to record the last 5 minutes function is painfully absent. So please forgive me if you are watching this video that half of what's on screen seems to be covered in Vaseline and are mostly irrelevant to the text, and that you don't get to see me desperately paddling away from a pack of wild dogs. Apology in advance. Still, I wished something would come out of it creatively. So the goal of writing about something fresh on my mind vanished with time and, more importantly, my personal growth, and instead replaced by revisiting that 8 days of my life like an archaeologist examining a piece of relic after dusting off years of dirt. One of the few key observations I made along the way caused the realization of just how big the country actually is. Iowa City to Ann Arbor covers 4 states: Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, and roughly 480 miles of roads. That counts about half of the entire Midwest horizontally on the map, and the Midwest is only barely a third of the entire continental U.S. Once you experience the scale with your 2 legs, the first thought would be awing about how big of a feat that actually was, followed by the second thought of let's never do that again. Another observation had to do with how diverse the landscape is, which scales neatly with the previous. Iowa and the first half of Illinois' vast flat plains, often populated by sometimes seemingly vaster cornfields, transition seamlessly into meandering, muddy trails alongside branches of Mississippi I have never heard of, which itself transitioned into the massive urban sprawl of the greater Chicago area, south of the Great Lakes. Once entering the lower peninsula of Michigan, it was all mosaics of dramatic hills, valleys, lakes, all patiently carpeted by the long-gone icebergs over millenniums. The last observation, and perhaps the most important one in hindsight, is how similar everywhere human left their marks is when looking up close, despite all the aforementioned natural dissimilarities. No matter which state I was in, I could always count on cheap pizza slices in random gas stops and roadside diners proudly writing they have the best cherry pies in 50 miles radius on a chalkboard. America as a country is known for its baseline uniformity of what constitutes as a so-called everytown USA. For a reckless lone biker like I was, my experience almost felt deliberately curated and balanced for me to, at the same time, not be completely overwhelmed by the stress of hunger, thirst, and fatigue, while having the satisfaction of reaching the next town for replenishment being that much sweeter, as if in a survival-themed video game. That is not to say there is nothing peculiar or worth noting in the cities and towns I passed through, however. just south of the Michigan Lake approaching Indiana's eastern border. By sunset, after emerging from a seemingly never-ending bike trail spanning horizontally across the state, I found myself facing an endless green field. Massive towers holding up power lines indicating the presence of community in the distance. Thin clouds draped over the night sky where heat was just beginning to recede, blanketed the sunlight, coloring the space just above the horizon with various tints of red and orange like Bob Ross brushstrokes. It was the moment of melancholic blend of what's nature and mankind out of the intention of neither. Less extraordinary and more bizarre was on the rather uneventful day in Michigan surrounded by cornfields. It was an overcast day, which to me was a blessing. Away from the heat, albeit the occasional wind blowing sideways got me all wobbly. And then, there it was. In a cornfield, a 60 feet tall flagpole with a bigger-than-average American flag. A loud and proud demonstration of the landowner's patriotism that sits defiantly in a solitude, not because of any exceptional courage, but for the simple reason of being alone in the middle of nowhere. That flag really was America and its self-contradictions in a nutshell, and how the contradictions reflected on the nation culturally and politically really does take a road trip on two wheels to take a glimpse at. During the first day, the grand exodus from Iowa, I encountered two fellow bikers on a bridge over Cedar River, a little outside the tiny town seriously called Moscow. They asked me if I wanted to cruise, since they would go about the same general direction as I did for a bit. I said yes, anything or anyone to break off the monotony. I had considered giving up many times that day.
How you doing, sir? Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing, guys?
Where you going?
What?
Where you going to?
I'm going to Davenport.
Okay. How you going? Do you know? You know how you're going? What direction? What roads you're going on?
Well, yeah, I mapped everything out. I'll be turning left to Moscow in just a minute.
Yep. That's where we're going.
Oh, cool.
And then you go take a right.
Yeah.
Okay. You end up in a little town called Welton, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're going.
Cool.
Less traffic that way.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of traffic out here on Saturday. You going up 6, going into Davenport?
Well, that's my destination for the day.
Okay.
All the way to where I'm going.
Okay. Where are you going to?
Michigan.
Michigan.
Yeah, it'll take like a week.
So you can ride your bike to Michigan, huh?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Just can't leave this thing alone back in Iowa, I guess.
No, it's a long ways to Michigan.
I know.
Together, we took a little detour skirting by Moscow town center, which was not much to see other than rows of houses. Toward Wilton, where we parted ways and I had my late lunch. 2017 was the first year when Donald Trump became president. The November night that sailed into reality still felt so recent. The gravity and uncertainty of it were still keenly felt by every adamant liberal like I was at the time. As we rode through Moscow, one of my cruise companions gestured toward the houses next to us and said, "Here resides the community of the president's supporters." Even though most of my brain cells during bike ride were spent thinking about when I can stop doing the bike ride, I felt a distinct sense of revulsion. As a foreigner and a minority in this country's ethnicity makeup, and as someone who had never lived outside a solid D-voting city for a prolonged period of time during my entire stay here in the States, being so closely proximate to supporters of big-mouthed conman who believes climate change is made up by people who look like me, seems hard-coded for me to be an uncomfortable experience. Fortunately, though, I was accompanied and escorted by the two decent, welcoming, progressive-minded, Democrat-voting bikers in this treacherous land. They are the real Americans I fell in love with and wanted to be one of, as in contrast to those backward-thinking rednecks occupying the houses around us. When we stopped by Wilton, they made sure I knew my way forward and even gave me their contact information in case I needed someone to call in a pinch, which vindicated my belief. Days later in Illinois, as my belly gave out the final call before turning into a self-consuming black hole, I took us south and found, according to Google, the best diner near me called Somber Cafe. Upon entering the place, I noticed the TV was putting on Fox News. The immediate implication was obvious, but I was hungry enough, and the TV volume was low enough to be completely drowned out by my headphones. I followed my instinct, sat down, and ordered a meal. I forgot what I ordered. Probably a standard breakfast platter with scrambled eggs on toast and 2 strips of bacon. But I remembered the friendliness of the server, a silver-haired woman, not taken aback by the out-of-placeness of me, a sweaty Asian man in a mostly white and rural county. When I asked her to fill my water bottle, she happily obliged. I know it all sounded quite corny. 2 anecdotes of friendliness from both ends of the political spectrum. So what? But it's worth bearing in mind that political divisiveness, often brought up by the overpaid talking heads and late-night comedians, is really very, very silly and manufactured. The Trump administration was indeed vicious, and with it sees the rise of far-right extremism that may still very well bring a slew of nightmare that one day lands on me. And yes, I do personally feel frustrated by American public of not seeing the great majority of who they elected fundamentally have none of their interests at heart. But what the politicians inside and through mainstream news media got broadcasted to nearly every flat-inch screen, much like the wine in Songbird Cafe, is having Americans at each other's throat in an atmosphere of suspicion and scapegoating among the electorates of both parties. Given the daily humanitarian debacle at the southern border and the increasing amount of violence motivated by hate, the fear-mongering did work on some people, but not most, either out of apathetic indifference or, which I believe to be the majority consensus, just getting really, really tired of those nonsense and hoping for the key being handed to something outside of the good old capitalist spectrum. Throughout my journey, I rode by dozens of cities and towns. One of them was Niles, Michigan, population 11,000. The hospital that sits in its center, proudly demonstrating the city's worthiness of its municipality status, is plagued by poor reviews I later stumbled upon, suggesting sketchy, unprofessional, and even downright homophobic practices from the staff. When I got to Ann Arbor, after staying a few days in the temporary home, I immediately flew to New York City, population tens of millions, for a few days of Broadway glamour. In terms of the gathering of social modernity, wealth, and population, they couldn't be more on the opposite ends of one another. But the common sides between the two were boarded-up windows of recently going under businesses, homeless veterans begging for a few dollars to get by, and working people going day in and day out, bound and tied by their jobs that pay the slave wage. Boarded-up businesses are probably 1 in 5 in Niles and 1 in 100 in New York City, which could explain why the sales pitch of Make America Great Again is so appealing to the people in Niles or Moscow, Iowa, or those who get their morning coffee in Songbird Cafe. But the commonality boils down to that America simply just isn't working out as how it says it is for the average people on either ends of the arbitrary divide. 2020 was another election year, and a year during which I had changed dramatically in my political standing. Hindsight is 2020, so the liberal talking heads said as they begrudgingly put away the Hillary signs. But the same people keep pushing tweets like this to my timeline, back when I still used Twitter. The problem with Bernie Sanders is he romanticizes rural America. He doesn't see them as gun-toting, anti-immigrant, anti-gay, anti-civil rights, anti-anything white evangelical Christians. He sees them as normal Americans just trying to survive. Sure enough, hindsight wasn't 2020. The cycle of exploitation and gaslighting dredged on with a fresh coat of paint under new management, the answer to the same master as the previous one, in the ongoing Biden administration. No matter how many dark-branded memes, can't save this inarguable train wreck. To paraphrase Mr. Caldwell-Gervais, America is like a sketchily cheap house that the owner swears to be fine and dandy, only to later discover the floor cracks louder than it should and the smell of rotting flesh coming from just beneath the basement concrete. That analogy still hasn't lost on me, especially now. Trump and his cohort may have been temporarily shoved into the basement, but the frame is still creaky, the electric lines are still chewed up, and nobody has any interest in removing that piece of gum on the blackened kitchen floor that increasingly blends in. About a few miles to downtown Davenport, my destination of the first day, the sun was almost completely set. After going separate ways with my cruise buddies, thanks to the bridge renovation, I managed to have a 5-mile stretch of a 2-lane road all to myself. But the closer I was to the state border, cars were back being my companions, more and more of them, and they felt more unwelcome than ever. So I stopped by the exit of a community driveway and decided to call a cab. Thanks to what appeared to be a convention in town, almost every cab service was quite busy. Eventually, one that had no star rating answered my call and said they would dispatch for me once the driver finished his last gig. As I later discovered, they had only one cab and one driver. It could be because perceptions morphed memories, but I swear the guy who eventually came wore stars and stripes that gave off an unquenchable rock star vibe. He went by Rusty. The moment I stepped out of his cab as he unloaded my bike and shook my hand, I knew he had to be included in this project out of the mandate that his presence counted as something interesting that day, although I had been struggling to come up with how to actually write about him. I was half asleep when getting on Rusty's cab. Less than 10 minutes later, the sleepiness was gone. I was only half interested when Rusty said he sang in a band in town, which was already what I half expected through just looking at the guy. When he asked what kind of music I was into, I said musical theater, half expecting the conversation to cease right there. But Rusty said the following magical words. "Oh, have you heard of Chess the Musical?" I did know Chess, still do, but it seems no one else on earth does until then, in that cab car with Rusty. Rusty went on to explain how he grew up listening to his mother's vinyl version of the original cast recording after his family moved from Cedar Rapids to Rock Island just across the lake of Davenport, and how he remembered every line in every song. He went on to give an improv performance of an Act 1 number which he absolutely nailed. At the same time, my mind slipped into a mode of third-person reminiscing. Being a kid growing up in the cramped apartment 7,000 miles away, I couldn't imagine what life was like living through adolescence in the heartland of American Midwest. But the sensation of having a piece of art so integral, so intimate in one's domestic life, where heart and mind could be comfortably and warmly tucked under, is something I am personally very familiar with. I wish I can say theater is an art form that I'm intimately familiar with, but that would be entirely dishonest. I was sucked in by the art form, certainly, so much so that musical theater's albums were constant companions for me throughout the journey. Traversing the swampy trail, getting my pants torn up vaulting my bike over the tree trunk, blocking the forward path, while the 2011 cast recording of Cole Porter's Anything Goes blasting in my ear is hell of a sensory experience I doubt anyone on earth besides me had been through. I saw many musicals and plays, knew many show tunes like the back of my hands, studied acting and playwriting as electives in college, occasionally hung out with theater people, but either it is too much of a departure from what I chose as my future bread and butter, or my hearts were just not at it. I was never in the sphere to be called a theater person. Rather, on hindsight, I was on its peripheral that made me feel that I was one. So close that the proximity creates an illusion of belonging that I will be forced to snap out of one day. That train of thought was a can of worms that had yet to be able to reseal ever since it was first conceived shortly after I graduated from college and shortly before I was about to embark on the journey. I saw too much resemblance in it with how I felt about Iowa City. 3 years later, that resemblance expanded in scope exponentially like cancer cells that eventually encapsulate how I see myself with the entire US of A. Is it also a metaphor for my tenuous experience with America itself? Am I destined to only be approximate to it, its people, and its culture, and never truly one with it? Like an actor too invested in their character and their position in the universe of a stage play? For theater plays big to small, road trips has been an understandably common setting. Strangers cooped up together for a prolonged period of time with nothing to do besides the roadside views getting diminishingly less interesting. Striking up conversation is just natural. If the aforementioned question occurred to me on that day, I would probably bring it up to Rusty. I was relaxed enough and wanted to strike up conversation as much as I could enough after the ice is broken. From a thematic perspective, the backdrop of a constant forward motion lines up cleanly as an easy metaphor for character development and growth. And the destination marks the end of a transformation. Strangers becoming friends, having conflicts, then resolving said conflicts in a brief time window is only plausible in theater or on the road. The less obvious metaphor is that it's a mean to linger. You are neither here or there. As long as you are somewhere in between the two, who can say you have truly left when you haven't made it there, insofar as the other end hasn't contaminated your thought, and it's still free to be occupied by what you are soon to leave behind? I have played a little game called Kentucky Route Zero, a point-and-click adventure game with a simple premise. You start as a truck driver, trying to make a delivery to an address just outside the exit of the titular Route Zero. All the while, the number of player characters grow into a sizable entourage of misfits. But constantly, the characters find themselves sidetracked, lost. Rarely do they pick up clues that points them toward their elusive target, but then proceed to be sidetracked and lost again, over and over, as the game picked up an increasingly surreal tone, all the way into the realm of magical realism. From a booze factory distilling moonshine from corpses of the indebted as a form of paying said debt, to a computer lab nestled in a massive cave surrounded by mountains of CRT monitors, to a house being moved back and forth by a giant bird between the forest and the gentrification museum. Kentucky Route Zero is a divisive game to say the least. Fans of the game, including Mr. Caldwell-Gervais, think it's a masterful blend of LucasArts-era point-and-click adventure with theater, literature, and poetry. Those hated it think it's a tedious and meandering mess that doesn't go anywhere, while pestering players with pretentious writing and imagery every step of the way. Not to mention the full game took 8 freaking years for the development to be done and dusted, since the first act dropped in 2013. For me though, being tedious and meandering might as well be the point of the game. I'm a tedious and meandering person with a near terminal case of procrastination, if I haven't made that clear. Just a few things into the game, it became obvious that the main characters, Connor and Shannon, weren't going to just drive the rusty piece of truck to zero. They were lingering for a time when Connor's antique business was profitable and his son still alive, lingering for a childhood when Shannon playing with Weaver at the mine before the mining company pulled out and took away their parents' jobs. I was lingering too, lingering for the period of my life that, for the first time, I was free to explore my interest, what makes me happy, and, in short, myself. But we have to make it to the end, at some point. The lingering has to end no matter how comforting it makes me feel, and the terrifying unknown has to be faced. That's the power of theater too. Outside of a 15-minute smoke break between acts, the audiences are, for all intents and purposes, stuck with the characters and watch them change into something different from the people they started as. There is no filler episode in theater, no sequel after sequel, just like I can't forever live on the road without arriving at some destination. Rusty passed away in 2020. I got the news on Facebook. When I saw the post, besides the indescribable shock I felt at the moment, all I could thought of was that I asked him that whether I have his consent to mention him by name if this project ever come to fruition. During one of the few times I talked to him through texts after we parted ways, to which he happily obliged. He also wanted me to come by to pay him a visit if I ever returned to Iowa to see his band performing, and I finally knew how to write about him. I just never thought it would be in the form of a tribute to a friend, and witness to my presence in that now distant country, and my attempt to linger before future subsumes me. And with him, I just lost another person I know in that country. My sense of belonging in that country just lost another piece of credibility. I miss Rusty. I wish to one day be able to visit wherever he was laid to rest. I also wish he knows that he lent the company and encouragement to the young man at one of his lowest moments, just enough for him to keep on keeping on the journey. And that's pretty damn theatrical, more so than much of my attempt to delve into the world of theater in any professional manner. As early as May 2017, merely weeks after I accepted enrollment into the Graduate School of Engineering Department of the University of Michigan, it was quite clear that I had to ride my bike all the way to Ann Arbor. It just had to be this way. That was quite a long time before my departure, when everyone sought to talk me out of it, once they realized it wasn't a joke. My parents being the most hysterical ones in the bunch. You can say it's an act of petulancy, even though on hindsight it kind of was. I didn't care. I was damn sure not to have my way out by sitting in the back of a Greyhound bus. It is debatable whether Iowa City is my hometown, but it just is if you ask me back in the day. There are two common definitions for hometown. 1. The town or city where a person was born and raised. 2. The current permanent location of residency of a person. Maybe it's my often unfounded inner condescension toward others speaking, but I feel like one of the minority that choose the latter, because I appreciate the implication of room for free will and choice in it. Consider this. I came to America when I was 19. By 2017, it had been 5 years went by since then. I spent the great majority of my adulthood in a country that is foreign to me in terms of legality, and among which I spent the majority of the time living in a small town in the heart of American Midwest, where the once strange and sometimes eccentric Uncle Sam became a comforting companion after I truly got to talk to him and know him for a little bit, through the small window he left open for me. A significant portion of everything that made me the person I am today took place in this time period. So, who else has the authoritative voice to decide whether Iowa City is my hometown other than me? The moment when I realized there would be no more reason for me to stay in Iowa City was a terrifying one, and it also got me to infinitely grow an appreciation or envy toward the first definition. It burns my eyes every time when I attempt to scrutinize its intensity. School was the whole point I settled down there, all the way back in 2012, and now I was done. I had no relative, owned no property in town. In terms of job market for environmental major, Iowa was as dry as the worst drought it ever received. It was like a higher being made up its mind to evict me from my self-declared hometown, no matter how hard I wanted to tell it to go fuck itself. So, that was when I made a decision to make my exit with full volition and autonomy. I choose when and how I leave, and the rest is history partially recorded in this video. In case you wonder if I made it to the end by myself on two wheels, the answer is yes, I did. Despite a hitch toward the end of the first day, and many other hitches big and small along the way, including a full day off in Michigan City, Indiana, 8 days later, in a bright and cheerful afternoon, I was on a scenic riverside road when I finally saw the sign indicating my entrance to Ann Arbor's city limit. It wasn't much of a victory lap, though. I had torn 2 pairs of pants. My left hand felt a persistent numbness for months that I had to eventually go to the doctors for after the day I pressed on it so hard on the handle, trying to escape the cornfields in Illinois after sundown when their creepiness died up to 11 straight into the territory of Stephen King books. And the bike I trusted for 5 whole years was mercilessly put out of commission after an unfixable crack was discovered on the frame during checkup, which wasn't there before my departure. I was terrified by the implication that the crack could have grown into a canyon that resulted in a catastrophe when I was in the middle of nowhere, but all I am right now is just glad and very grateful that it didn't, and the bike carried me to the finish line and became the only casualty in my most elaborate attempt to give a middle finger to fate instead of the other way around. Which brings back to the memoir purpose of this writing. In May 2020, when I started writing this essay, 2 months from the 3-year anniversary of the journey, the significance of the experience suddenly ballooned exponentially that made it both more cherishable and devastating. The same higher power that pushed me into the bike trip is executing its scheme again. This time, it wanted me out of the country entirely. At midnight of June 30th of that year, mere weeks from then, I lost the ability to legally find paid employment. 60 days after that, my mere presence within the borders enclosing this continent from coast to coast became illegal. America, the same America where I rode as far as 10 miles without seeing a living human except occasional lonely pickup drivers, was proclaiming to my face that there is no place inside for me without a shred of irony, and that a magnificent fucking hypocrisy if I ever see one. Almost as if my spitefulness to it was expected, until this day, a global pandemic is still seemingly a long way from ever easing, just to rub it in. During the period of a few months before the inevitability, shops, restaurants, concerts, movie theaters, all the social and cultural conveniences we take for granted, suddenly vanished into a full-on quarantine and took away my ability for a last hurrah or the simple act of grieving what would be lost. The void left behind in their absence is ironically more felt than when they were readily available, because it is, in the end, a void in the perception of time. From a utilitarian perspective, most of us trading bulk of our time on the job for the ability to feel like ourselves doing the rest, for the sense of security. When gears of society halted grinding, time doesn't stop, it just exchanges with nothing. For those that lost their jobs, it even maliciously feeds into the insecurity of having their bank accounts slowly running dry in a vicious cycle. To my utmost fortune, I still have the financial backing of my family to bail me out on hard times, but time manages to play a mockery on me anyway. The time right now is 2022. I had survived longer than 2 years in a country that is legally my home. I work a job that is grueling both in its hours and in how little of a shit it gives on the emotional tolls it laid on me. More than ever have I missed the 8 days of nothing but me, my bike, the roads extending far beyond horizon, and, perhaps most importantly, a distant but sure goal that I could work toward one pedal at a time. I also miss America. Not much of its government or its many backwardness in its policies, but its landscape, culture, the greasy but delicious breakfast, and seemingly endless possibilities to create friendships and stories with all kinds of people in the great melting pot. To me, it often feels like time is still standing in place, like a half-finished movie on Netflix I paused when I have to go out and get grocery. It is as if the life I'm currently living is a punishment in limbo, or more aptly, a gruesomely long checkout line at a local Kroger store, that I may someday suffer through in full to finally return to my real life and hit on pause. I want to wrap up this essay with a hopeful note, something akin to even though life is hard, I had gradually opened up myself to what it is and began to move on. But that would be even more dishonest than to say I'm a theater aficionado. That is, however, not to say things aren't changing, just not in a way that I expected. Despite a constant sense of not belonging, despite the almost daily anxiety about my future, despite a day-to-day grind on my horrible job dealing with horrible people, just like everything happening in the past, time still grinds my conscience little by little, day after day, and before I knew it, I made good friends with people I thought unable to connect with, got used to the way of life I thought impossible to adjust to, and my memory of the 8 years in America, whether I like it or not, gradually became more and more hazy, and more comfortably settling behind the veil that separates conscious and unconsciousness. There are habits I will probably never adjust out of, like preferring to read and write in English, but more and more I begin to accept the fact that, much like the paper plate I held in the slice of cheese pizza with in that gas station in Wilton, Iowa, the America I long to return to is also in the rearview mirrors, getting smaller and smaller. No matter how the country came across as unchanging, it is after all a subjective perception called nostalgia, and just like every other type of nostalgia, they shatter instantly when exposed to the air known as the present, not helped by the fact that the America in the news is still constantly defined by political division, gun violence, and increasing unwillingness to give a shit about any of its problems. Living in China sometimes honestly feels like a bubble, where I can safely pretend those things that once got me up in arms with aren't even real. Come to think of it, how much do I really know about America? Maybe I was just an outsider and passerby after all. Maybe the brief interchanges with Uncle Sam were not much more than looking him up retroactively. America is in the rear view. Now what? I don't know. What my life has been until then, what does it all mean? I don't know. For many months, I struggled to write an ending to this project that started as a travelogue and gradually approached the verge of becoming a whiny, self-pitying diatribe that runs in circles. And this really had been my mental state in a nutshell in the past 2 years, as I slowly and surely went over the midway point of the final year before I hit 30. 30 years old, what a monumental age, said societies, both East and West. By the age of 30, Stephen Sondheim was already lyricist for 2 musicals and wrote the first of his own. By the age of 30, Noah Gervais toured half of continental US in his custom-built Volkswagen bus with hours of amazing commentaries to provoke and inspire. What do I have to show for when I'm by the age of 30? Thinking about this question had sent me under endless spirals of depression and regrets but missed opportunities. If I did this and that, or was just braver by a notch than I was comfortable with, maybe I could have achieved whatever by now. And in that process, I find myself a more and more fearful person, unsure of himself and willing to relinquish control out of fear for further failures. So much so it began to poison my relationships with others. During this period of time, however, every once in a while I opened this project with hopes to wrap it up. Although I had failed to do so until now, every time in attempt of doing so, myself was reminded of the fact that I rode a freaking bicycle across the hard line of the United States, a country thousands of miles away from where I'm standing, and came away from it with more than one hell of a story to tell. I went on roads and rode by towns I would have never visited, met people I would never have met had I took any other means of transportation. I almost fell into a pothole, got chased by a pack of dogs, and half dodged a shower in what I presume was one of the last video rental stores in the country. And that is exactly what I have to show for. And I accomplished it not even halfway through my 20s. I don't think it changed me in some fundamental ways, but if anything, it's proof and reminder that I'm a person capable of grandeur, capable of tackling risks when I put my mind to it, even the most unnecessary ones. This experience, on top of all that time I was among the people that pride themselves as free and bold, those lessons I landed at Ann Arbor, Michigan with, are all to be alive and well. The question is, what can I do with it? Maybe I'm not ready to answer that question just yet, but it's probably time to at least wrap up this project. Thank you for your time.